Your Majesty, if we got on a plane and went to Jordan, Middle East, the Arab world, what would we see? What would we discover? What would we learn?
I think an extraordinarily complex, rich tapestry of peoples and landscapes and history, culture, heritage. It's impossible to really answer that question without taking up the entire half hour. So I think a great deal more than anyone ever anticipates. My late husband, King Hussein, we're a resource-poor country, but he put an enormous amount of effort and energy into creating an airline, a Royal Jordanian, because he understood how important it was for people to have face-to-face contact and to bring people into the region and to take the reality, the cultural, social, religious, political realities even of the region out to the larger world.
Thank you. Hisham, what's the buzz on the street? They say the Arab street.
I don't like the term Arab street.
All right, good.
Because it means that Arab public opinion can only be expressed in violent riots in the streets or protests in the street. We have public opinion, like everybody else. And yet, we may not have democratic regimes on the whole, and some of them are more open than others. But public opinion can be measured, and it is being measured now, the way we measure it here, opinion polling, and there are many ways, subtle ways, indirect ways, where public opinion, such as Diwaniyah, for instance, the concept of Diwaniyah when people get together in the Gulf states. And in a place like Lebanon, you have a freer press. In the Gulf now, they are opening up in Jordan, in Tunisia, and Morocco. I mean, there is a process of opening up. Not enough, in my opinion, in my estimation. But that's why I'm very sensitive to this term Arab street, because it denigrates Arab public opinion. There is an Arab public opinion. It is varied. Look, we don't call it the Arab world for nothing. This is a world populated mostly by Sunni Arabs. But we have Shia, we have Druze, we have all sorts of subgroups. We have the Berber, we have the Kurds, we have the others. And Arabs, in a way, are like Americans. They can be black as they come. They can be as white. They can look like Irish. You should have seen my grandfather. And we can be. They can be tall. They can be dark skinned. They can be. And we are not a race. We cannot be reduced to a race. We cannot be a great. I'm happy that we cannot be reduced to a race or an ethnicity or even a religion. And that's why that tapestry is what defines the Arab.
22 countries and around 320 million people.
Right. I was going to ask Dr. Nasr exactly what Her Majesty says. We've got about 325 million. But how many Muslims in the world?
1,400,000,000, something like that.
1.4. Now, in America, incredible confusion between the two.
Well, naturally, because historically speaking, the part of the Islamic world which first had contact with the West was the Arab world. And of course, a very important part of Europe, Spain, was for 800 years a Muslim country, not for 80 years. 800 years, twice the age of the United States since the colonial period. Obviously, the European mind identified the Islamic world with the Arab world. And even later on, when the Persian and Turkish worlds had contact with the Western world, this medieval idea did not go away, and it still subsists. But the Arabs are a minority with less than 25% of all Muslims in the world.
Let me ask Laila. We are bombarded with images on television and film about Arab people. What are we seeing? What are those messages saying?
Well, you know, the trend in the past has generally been the picture of an Arab being violent or a woman being oppressed, not necessarily educated. And we've kind of battled that for the last 20 or so years. The terrorist villain has always been an Arab. I have to say, though, in the past several years, certainly after 9/11, we saw a lot more nuanced portrayals of Arabs and Arab Americans and Islam. We still have a long way to go, but it's certainly a lot better. The area where I am a little bit concerned, or I do see an area where we should all be concerned, is the types of things that people say about Arabs, Muslims, and Islam in the Arab world on news programs, television news programs.
What are they saying?
We've seen all sorts of different reporters, anchors, saying some really negative, nasty things about Arabs, and also a lot of factually inaccurate things about Arabs and Muslims. And we tend to see, we're continuing to see this, unfortunately, on very mainstream programs. So I think that that's really an area of concern for us.
Ambassador Chamberlain, is there indeed still a clash of civilizations What's the myth? What's the reality?
Well, I've never believed that there was a class of civilization. I think it is important, however, that we in the West, we in the United States, understand cultures abroad. And that understanding is important on both sides, of course, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a clash. One of the things that we need to understand is that there's frankly more that unite us than divide us. Most of the 1.4 billion Muslims in the world are family-oriented, religious people who are struggling to cope with the modern life, just as most Americans are. And we have more in common than we realize.
Dr. Anthony, when you look at the peoples, the governments, the business climate, and you address the U.S.-Arab relations, what do you see? What comes up on your radar?
Well, there's enormous diversity, and it's already been implied in the statements of some others. 22 Arab countries, each is different, like fingerprints and snowflakes. No two are the same. They're diverse in their history, they're diverse in their size, they're diverse in their populations, they're diverse in their needs, diverse in their concerns, diverse in their interests, diverse in their objectives, and diverse in the relations that they have with the world beyond their shores. It's impossible to generalize about all 22 without being unfair and misleading and grossly stereotyping in the negative sense.
Let me tell the folks at home, this is America. This is America Visits the Arab World. Sit tight. We'll be back in just a second.
This is America is brought to you by Hyundai Motor America, maker of the 2009 Sonata. The National Education Association, the nation's largest advocate for children and public education. The Rotondaro Family Trust, the CTC Foundation, and the American Life TV network.
When we talk about the Arab world, what's important? What's important to Arab people?
Well, there was a Gallup poll recently that said, in which Arabs expressed themselves very clearly in terms of relations between the West and the Arab world, which was stop disrespecting us, stop treating us as if we're inferior. So back to the media question. And your comment about the media belied your youth, I think, because in fact the stereotyping has been going on for almost 100 years or more in various forms of media. But in terms of the media that now increasingly seems to tutor our children, which is television and new technologies, the images that have come through on television until recently, where there is now there are more platforms for information gathering and for information dissemination, has been portrayed Arabs and Muslims in an extremely negative light. And research shows that when you show humiliating and negative images of different groups repeatedly, which is what has happened with Arabs and Muslims in American media over a long period of time, that can prompt responses that can lead to very negative and even violent responses. And it doesn't have to be Arabs and Muslims, it can be any minority group that feels targeted by the media.
You know, what we had found, I worked for an Arab civil rights organization, and right after 9/11 we found that a lot of the violent hate crimes that happened to members of the community were actually people who are not necessarily members of the community. The stereotype, or the person who would act out and, you know, and lash out in a violent hate crime, they lashed out at a lot of Sikhs who are neither Arabs nor Muslims. A lot of Hispanics were caught up in this because they were brown skinned. So we did find that people don't have a frame of reference for what it means.
Jump in.
I'd like to pick up on the point that you make, because I think it's very important that you both have made, and that is respect. That the result of the poll that you mentioned, Your Majesty, was that Arabs around the world would like to see the West respect Islam. The number of times that President Obama mentioned respect in historic interview of him, set a record. He has changed the tone on respect for Islam in a very short period. And I think that this is a significant point.
And in his first trip to Europe, which is focused on economic issues, he talked about Muslim, Arab. I don't know if we timed this because of the, but he also emphasized that, which was.
Of course, the coming of President Obama is a very, very important opportunity for a new understanding. But actually, we have to ask ourselves the question: why is there so much Islamophobia and now Hinduphobia? Or Buddhism phobia? Why is it? Or Buddhist phobia? There's a deeper historical reason that we have to face. Islam was always the other for the whole period of the growing up of Western civilization, during its adolescence and maturity, which people carry within themselves. And whatever Western Christianity didn't like, it would usually attribute to Islam, if you read the whole history. And that was getting somewhat better. After the devastating attack of the Orientalists in the 19th century, it was getting somewhat better in the early 20th century, especially meeting between Christian religious schools and churches and Islam, until, of course, several events came one after another, starting really with the partition of Palestine, with the Iranian Revolution, with what happened in Afghanistan, and of course, finally with 9/11. We have a very big job on our hands because we cannot only deal with what has happened in the last 20 years. These things are very, very deep down. No one in the President's United States at the present moment would dare to come on television and say something against any religion of the world except Islam. Even the American Indian Navajo religion, who would dare come and say something about the Navajo religion?
I want to pick up on a point that Laila made a little while ago when she was talking. If you went around to many Americans and said the word Arab and say, tell me what comes into your mind, they're going to say terrorist. You said after the 9/11, people became a little bit more nuanced in how they were trying to learn. Dr. Nasr is shaking his head right away. Go ahead.
I wish this were the case. I think after 9/11, two important currents occurred which were in opposite directions. One was an ever greater hatred of Muslims, identification of Islam with terrorism, especially the Arabs, but also Pakistanis and others, and even Sikhs, because they wore a turban, which is an Islamic headdress. But the other one was, because of this event, greater interest on part of many people to learn more about Islam.
To learn more.
I should also clarify my comments. I'm saying that in the scope of Hollywood films, we've seen generally a little bit better of a trend. But I agree. While there still have been a lot of calls to try and learn more about the Arab world, to learn more about Islam. There's a long way we need to go before that happens. And the doctor is absolutely correct. I mean, there is a lot of Islamophobia here in the United States, whether it's on college campuses, whether it's on general news programs, whether it's on in the last election, in the election of President Obama, we saw a lot of Islamophobia and anti-Arab rhetoric in the election, in the whole process, and I think that speaks volumes.
This business of say the word Arab and people say terrorist, how do you begin to counteract that?
I'll answer, but let me say something broad. I mean, look, the history of Arab-Western relationship, European and then Americans, is very complex. The encounter between Muslims, the rising power of Islam and the Arabs early on with the Europeans was bloody, complex. But if you look at the Mediterranean and just picture the whole Mediterranean basin, you've seen armies going from the west to east and from east to west, but then you see trade, you see human relationship, you see scientific exchanges, and you see learning. Even the crusade was a great experience for the Europeans to learn more from the Arabs and Muslims who were way ahead of them in sciences, in medicine, and whatever. So we have that legacy. When the Arabs and the Muslims were taking over Asia Minor, which is a peninsula, the Europeans were retaking over Portugal and Spain. So we have that legacy. In the collective memory of the Europeans, the Arabs and the Muslims are the Ottomans. The Ottomans were knocking on the gates of Vienna in the 16th, 17th century, which is nothing in history. And then we have the history of the Crusades. Then we have to, in modern times, we have the history of colonialism. So it is a lot of baggage, a lot of stereotypical images. The books, anti-Muslim books in the West can comprise a pyramid. The same thing in the Arab world. Also, we demonize the West too, and we demonize Christianity too. So, I mean, let's be very clear about this historically. Now, in modern times, there was a huge reservoir of goodwill in the Arab and Muslim minds towards the United States, and it survived until the 1967 in particular. Eisenhower was lionized in the Arab world because he asked the Egyptians, they asked the Israelis and the Brits and the French to get out of Sinai.
Dr. Anthony is shaking your head and you've been listening. Jump in.
Shaking my head upward.
Not
horizontally. Yes, polls have been mentioned here, and they've been revealing in another context beyond that which we've already addressed, and that is right after 9/11, the phrase was, why do they hate us? Why do they hate us so much? They all hate us. And yet, respected survey after respected survey, Gallup, the Pew Charitable Trust, the Zogby polls have shown consistently that there's enormous and widespread and deeply rooted respect for the United States and for the American people, particularly in terms of personal freedom, especially with regard to education, additionally with regard to research and development, also with regard to science and technology, even to a degree music and fashion, and an element of food as well. The focus of all of these polls has said it's the policies, and the policies are political. And Hisham is right with regard to 67. I would date it 20 years earlier, 1947. That was the time where America went from not having a single critic, not one adversary, not one enemy in the region, to then having people saying, what's going on here? This is wrong. This is not America. This is morally unjust. And we're still living with that. That's our Achilles heel on the policies and the politics.
Let me put something on the table here for everybody to jump in. When Americans are looking at the Arab world, again, 22 countries, unfair, to just, judge. If you look at from Morocco to the Gulf, my Lord, the geography is amazing. But they say that the Arab world is harsh and repressive. Those are a couple of adjectives that I picked up in talking with people. Well, as if you talk with Arab folks, they will look at America and they will say materialistic and even immoral.
Hedonistic.
Hedonistic.
Look,
So everybody...
politically, Arab regimes on the whole are repressive. Arabs don't like to admit that. Arabs don't like to engage in introspection, just as sometimes Americans don't like to engage in self-criticism. We always criticize the United States for double standards, but we have our own double standards too. When somebody says what's happening in Darfur is a crime against humanity, the Arabs are very defensive. They have a summit and demand...
There's one very big difference. Not only the Arab world, the rest of the Islamic world, the rest of Asia, people do not identify themselves completely with the government. Whereas here they do a lot more, I'm not saying 100%. So there is a lot of criticism. It's not self-criticism, it's a criticism of the government that rules over them.
It's more complex. It's more complex than that. Really, we don't do enough introspection. It's always easy for us to dump it on the Israelis and on the West. And we keep talking about the Crusades and the colonial period.
That's those governments that actually encourage that. The real intellectual thinkers in the Arab world.
Unfortunately, there are a lot of intellectuals in the Arab world who are influenced by governments and work for governments, and those who are not working for governments are either in jail or in exile.
Let me take this away from a government perspective or a political perspective and look at it as from the human, as people. Dennis, you mentioned the word harsh. There's the myth about people in the Arab world. Actually, when you go to the Arab world, when you meet Arab people, you'll find just the opposite. You'll find that they're warm, courteous to an extreme, generous, very high value on charity. It's a very welcoming environment, in fact, for Americans to enter into an Arab family.
John, you wanted to say something. Go ahead.
What's supportive of this, the background, the context, and the perspective is that there have been more than 400 movies produced in the United States in which the Arab, the Middle Eastern, or the Muslim is other, those, them, in a villain role. I cannot cite a single one that has portrayed Arabs as neutral or moderate or respectful or laughing and kind or good sense of humor.
Dr. Nasr, will either cringe or smile when I say that I was watching one of the news broadcasts, you know, in the afternoon with the pundits talking, and somebody was talking about Islamic-speaking countries. He came from an Islamic-speaking country, and I said, did I just hear what I thought I heard? And this is a prominent reporter. You just introduced something, and I'm wondering if this is true, and it kind of pains me to put this out on the table, but I think it's something that people think. When the Arab folks are looking at America and see the economic collapse that we have triggered around the world, and also our engagement in war, they may see us, that may confirm some thinking that they may have about us. Just as, and you just put your finger on this, when Americans see the support of President Bashir of Sudan and the horror that has been part of that country and Darfur, they just look and say, how can they do that? So how does one confirm for the other what they have already built up as a stereotype?
It's in our duty as people who are interested in the future of the Middle East to be honest with ourselves. That yes, the American policy there has caused a great deal of pain. The Israeli policies have caused a great deal of pain. Colonialism still hovering over our collective memory. And yet, for the last 50 years, supposedly the Arabs and most Muslim countries have been ruling themselves. How is it that India, which became independent on the same moment that Pakistan and Egypt became independent, India is way ahead of them in terms of democracy, development, and all of these indices that you use to measure the progress of each country. And then in the Arab and the Muslim world, we don't do that. Look, Saddam Hussein was engaged in genocide against the Kurds, and you couldn't find a handful of Arabs, and I'm proud to have been one of them, who would criticize him publicly. And now with this Sudan, with this charade that took place in Doha, when the Arabs collectively embraced a man who's responsible, at least, for the death of 300,000 people. You know, people should talk about these things. And people who could defend the Arabs and love the Arabs should also be critical of the Arabs and show, but in that sense, not in the stereotypical way. So the challenge is to talk about the likes of Bashir and Saddam in the past and the dictators of the Arab world, but at the same time say the Arabs are their first victims.
How do you, Your Majesty, how do you start building bridges when you have this dichotomy that Hisham has just put on the table?
Well, I think communication, as I said at the outset, I think it's absolutely critical that there be more exchange, more dialogue, more discussion, so that people in the West can actually listen to a range of viewpoints from the region. And it is true, what Hisham says, and what you said, Dr. Nasr, that the politicians, the officials, official rhetoric tends to dominate the perceptions that are created in the West about the region. It becomes all politics. And that's partly because the Western media only covers the political side, and it's also because what comes from our side is more politics, and there isn't the funding and the support for the kind of cultural exchange that might take place. There was, after 9/11, a shutdown of opportunities for Arabs to come to the United States to study here. We'd had large numbers of young people from the Arab world coming and studying in the United States. It was a generation, several generations beyond the one that was educated at AUB, that was several generations of leaders in the region. Then you had a new generation or so of leaders coming to the United States. They were ambassadors on one hand of their own cultures and nations, and on the other hand, they returned back to their countries with an American education and inspired others to want to do that. That was a high ideal, to study in this country. That was shut down. It is slowly opening up, but it was one of the huge mistakes after 9/11 that took place, was the shutting down of dialogue and exchange out of fear. On both sides. Arabs did not want to come to the States because they felt they were going to be almost attacked at immigration, that they were going to be denigrated, that they were going to be humiliated. And on the other hand, in the United States, there was a fear an understandable fear, and it was unfortunately cultivated, that all Arabs presented a threat to people in this country. That is something I think we're moving beyond. None of us have talked about President Obama yet, and the fact that there is a new beginning now in the United States and its relationship with the rest of the world. We're seeing on his first trip to Europe more of what we saw in your interview with him and what we sensed during the campaign. And I think we're at a pivotal moment right now. I don't think the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is at the heart of so much of the problems in our region and the justifications that heads of state have used for continuing their, in many cases, repressive control of people in the region. But I think we can see the beginning of a new type of approach that is eliciting a very positive response from the region, greater hope and greater sense that maybe we can become partners as we all hoped in the past and as we need to be in the future.
For online video of all This Is America programs, visit our website, thisisamerica.net. This is America is brought to you by Hyundai Motor America, maker of the 2009 Sonata. The National Education Association, the nation's largest advocate for children and public education. The Rotondaro Family Trust, the CTC Foundation, and the American Life TV Network.